They called it the intake diagnostic, and the Verith Academy ran it on every new cadet the morning they arrived. I know that now. At the time I was 12 years old, I had been on the transit barge for 19 days, and all I wanted was a chair that didn't vibrate. The diagnostic chamber was on the third sublevel of the Academy's intake wing. Cold light, the kind that has no source you can point to. It just exists, flat and even, pressing down on everything. 6 reclined seats arranged in a wide arc, one fitted with a crown of filament-thin sensor leads. The chairs were made for adults. I sat in mine, with my feet 2 inches off the floor, and tried not to swing them, because I had a feeling that would not go over well. Professor Van Sarath stood at the front of the room. She was tall even by Verith standards. Long thorax, 4-jointed arms, folded at the middle, like someone had put a second elbow where there shouldn't be one. Coloring was the pale gray-green of old copper, and her eyes were lateral, which meant she could look at all 6 of us at once without turning her head. She was using that ability now. She looked at each of us in sequence, and when she got to me, she held the gaze a half-second longer than the others. I was the only human in the cohort. I was also the only one under the age of 19. The Academy's intake registry had classified me as an administrative variance, which I understood, when I finally got the paperwork translated, to mean that whoever had processed my application had checked a wrong box, and nobody downstream had caught it. I was supposed to be in a junior observation track on Verith's sister campus across the system. Instead, I was here, in a sublevel diagnostic chamber, with 5 alien cadets who had the good grace not to stare. Van Sarath explained what was about to happen in the clipped factual register of someone who had given this speech many times and had long since stopped caring whether it landed. The intake diagnostic was a cognitive architecture scan. It would map the structure of each cadet's neural processing network, identify the dominant reasoning pathways, assess the ceiling of pattern integration speed, and produce a tier classification. The classification would determine which instructional track you entered, what resources you were allocated, and, she said this without inflection, whether the Academy confirmed your enrollment or referred you to a more appropriate institution. She paused. Lateral eyes swept the arc. The system has run 431 intake cohorts, she said. It has never produced an unclassifiable result. It has never required a secondary assessment. It will not take longer than 20 minutes. Sit still and let it work. She stepped back. A technician I hadn't noticed before, small, rust-colored, 3-fingered, moved along the arc and settled the sensor crowns onto each of us in turn. When he got to me, he had to adjust the leads individually because the crown wasn't sized for a human skull and the filaments kept sliding toward my ears. He made a sound I couldn't translate. I held still and let him work. The light in the room shifted. Something behind my eyes, not painful, not quite pressure, more like the feeling of standing at the top of a tall building and knowing the height without looking down. I had been told to expect a mild cognitive stimulus. That was accurate. The way telling someone a marathon is a long run is accurate. The other cadets finished in sequence. The first was in 4 minutes. She was Dravathi, heavy gravity world, wide-set eyes, and she sat up straight when the crown released and looked at the display above her chair with the practiced calm of someone who had expected good news. The second finished at 6 minutes, the third at 9, the fourth at 11, the fifth at 14. Mine kept running. Sanarath had returned to the front of the room after the last cadet finished. She was watching my display. The 4 finished cadets were watching it too, with the cautious peripheral attention of people pretending not to stare at an accident. I was not in distress. I want to be precise about that. The sensation behind my eyes had not changed. Steady, even. The same not quite pressure it had been from the start. I was not fighting it. I was not straining against it. I was sitting in a chair with my feet 2 inches off the floor, watching the display above my head cycle through outputs I couldn't read, waiting for the machine to tell me something I already knew, which is that I was 12 years old and had grown up on a planet where children learn, wait, you wait, in line for the school bus in the cold because your mother is already at work and the door doesn't unlock until the driver arrives. You wait in the hospital ward because there are 17 people ahead of you, and the intake nurse has been on shift since the previous morning. You wait for news, for test results, for the adult in the room to finish their conversation and look at you. You wait for your father to get home, and sometimes he does, and sometimes he doesn't, and either way, dinner still gets made. You learn without anyone teaching you that the waiting is not the thing. The waiting is just the time before the thing. I had been waiting for 20 minutes, then 25. Then Sareth walked to my chair. She studied the display. Then she called the technician over, and they exchanged several words I couldn't follow, and the technician ran a secondary check on the crown leads, and then they both stood back and looked at the display again. The display was blank. Not an error state, not a spinning indicator, not a red failure code, just blank. The way a form looks when every field has been left empty, not because the form was broken, but because whatever was supposed to fill it in hadn't found any lines long enough to write on. Vensarath said, "That is not possible," she said it quietly. Not to me, to herself, or to the room. I said, "Do you want me to do it again?" She looked at me then, fully directly, with both lateral eyes oriented the same way, which I would later learn was something the Verath only did when something had genuinely surprised them. "What did you feel?" she asked. I thought about it. "The building feeling," I said. "Like standing at the top of something tall. And then I waited for the next question," I said. But it didn't come. There was a long silence. I understood later. TD. When I had been at the academy long enough to understand things, what had happened. The intake diagnostic worked by presenting the candidate's neural architecture with increasingly complex pattern integration problems. Not questions, not images, just raw structural demand. And measuring the ceiling, the point where the architecture began to fracture under load. Every neural architecture had a ceiling. The system was designed to find it. It had not found mine, not because there wasn't one, because the test had run out of problems before the ceiling came up. The system had been designed around the cognitive range of every species the Academy had ever enrolled. It had never enrolled a human child. It had no problems left that it hadn't already asked. That was the blank, not a failure, an absence of further questions. The door at the back of the diagnostic chamber opened. I hadn't seen anyone enter when we arrived. Someone had been in the observation room behind the mirror panel. Because the door opened, and a ranking officer walked in. She was Dravathi, the same heavy gravity build as the cadet who had finished first but older, with the blunt posture of someone who makes decisions for a living, and does not especially enjoy meetings about them. She was carrying a data slate and a stylus. She walked past Vensarath. She walked past my chair. She stood at the display for a moment, reading it. Then she turned. "Marsh," she said, my last name correctly pronounced, which meant she had looked me up before she walked through that door. "Yes," I said. "This is intermediate track intake," she said. "You were placed here by an administrative error." "I know," I said. She looked at the display. She looked at me. "The error was not the one they think it was," she said. She uncapped the stylus. "You'll stay. I'm signing the track reassignment now. Advanced cohort, effective tomorrow morning." She paused. "You'll need longer chairs." She signed the slate and walked back out, without waiting for a response from Vensarath, who had not moved from where she was standing. I looked at the display above my chair. Still blank, the machine had run out of questions, and nobody had thought to write new ones. On Earth, that just means you sit there until someone does.